Alrighty, I think we're going to get going here. We've got an informational brief today, and by the way, this is our last day of meeting today. So afterward, if you would take your committee books with you so that you can review any of the information in the off session, and I appreciate that very much. We've got informational brief today. I'm going to give each of our people 15, 20 minutes, right around that time period, so we have plenty of time for the committee to ask questions. So first up, we have J. Brent Legg, who's Executive Vice President of Governmental Affairs for Connected Nation, carrier-neutral internet exchange points, and why they're important for Kansas. Sir, welcome to committee.
Okay.
That always helps.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for inviting me today. I've had the privilege of presenting before this committee and several of you in the past. And normally we talk about broadband mapping, but we're going to talk about something different today, which is just as vitally important to the state of Kansas as broadband mapping. We're going to talk about carrier-neutral internet exchange points and why they're important as an element of broadband infrastructure that warrants the state's attention. So very quickly, who we are. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We were founded in Kentucky in 2001, but we have expanded our work over the past 21 years into more than 30 states. We have projects going in about 13 states currently. Our mission is very simple. We exist as a nonprofit to close the digital divide in all of its contexts. We have several key focus areas. Broadband mapping is one of those, and you've seen me present on that topic before. But also, we do a lot of advocacy to impact state and federal broadband policy to make sure that policies are enabled to actually close the digital divide. We also do a lot of state and local broadband strategic planning. We do work on school connectivity and assessing school connectivity, and we do programs that are focused on digital literacy and skills training. But today I want to talk about something that involves what we call middle mile infrastructure, which is not something that has historically been something that a lot of policymakers have focused on. A lot of focus historically has been on last mile connections to homes and businesses, which is vitally important. And that's where the digital divide is most significant, in rural places that don't have broadband access. So I've got a graphic up here on the screen that I just want to sort of orient or level set to the way the internet works, how internet traffic is exchanged. On the left-hand side is what probably most of you have focused on in your time on this committee and in your personal advocacy on broadband issues. And it's those last-mile connections to homes and small businesses, to schools, to government agencies, to major employer corporations in your districts. And we know that those last-mile connections are delivered through modalities like cable service, or fiber to the premises service, or copper telephone, DSL service, or through something called fixed wireless, where there's a fixed transmitter and receiver, and broadband is connected to the home wirelessly. But all of those different types of last mile modalities have to get back to the rest of the internet in some way, right? And so my friend and your future speaker after my presentation is over with, Court, is going to spend more time talking to you about middle mile broadband infrastructure and the fact that that is a key element of focus. But where internet traffic is actually exchanged with other networks is an area that is getting increasing focus at the federal level and needs to get increased focus at the state level. So internet traffic is generally exchanged in facilities called internet exchange points. Kansas City has a significant internet exchange point at a building called 1102 Grand Boulevard in downtown Kansas City. And this is a building where cloud services, where content delivery networks such as Netflix and Hulu, where cloud services like Amazon and Google peer and share content with last mile and middle mile broadband networks. You can think of it as the nexus for the internet. So Kansas City is literally the nexus of the internet for the Midwest United States. And then from that internet exchange point, internet service providers, even local internet service providers, buy what's called internet transit or IP transit, which is wholesale internet access, in order to reach the broader global internet. So the right-hand side of the graphic that you see on the screen here is where multiple internet transit providers compete for business, and those IP transit providers connect to other cloud services and the global internet for those services and websites that do not have a physical presence at 1102 Grand in Kansas City. So that's generally how internet traffic is exchanged. It's not been an area of focus for policymakers generally, and it can be quite complicated. But the purpose of my presentation today is to try to make it less complicated and to focus on the areas within Kansas where we need to bring interconnection closer to communities. As the internet evolves, the exchange of traffic in big cities like Kansas City or Dallas or Chicago or Minneapolis is simply not going to be good enough. The exchange of that traffic is going to need to occur closer to end users to reduce something that's called latency. Some of you have probably heard the term latency. And that is essentially the time that it takes for a packet of data to make a round trip to its destination. And that's different than bandwidth. Bandwidth is the size of the pipe through which data flows, right? So latency as real-time applications like autonomous vehicles and augmented reality glasses that is feeding information to you, right, on a real-time basis. As those things become more prolific, we're going to need to reduce latency further and further. And in order to do that, we need to bring the locations where internet traffic is exchanged closer to end users, and to give cloud and content services a physical home where that information is being exchanged. So we need to move out of Kansas City and bring that to places like Wichita, like Salina, like Hayes, Dodge City, Manhattan, because that's how the future of the internet is going to work. Everything from your watch to your glasses to your refrigerator is going to have an IP address, is going to have a presence on the internet. And for the state not to fall further behind in that, we need to bring physical interconnection points for network traffic exchange to hub communities and eventually even further out. So there are no internet exchange points physically within Kansas's borders today. One of 17 states that does not have one. Almost all of Kansas's internet traffic is either exchanged in Kansas City or at 910 15th Street in Denver. These are physical data center buildings where networks transact. Cloud and content services generally, as I said, come from these cities. And there is limited in Kansas north-south connectivity through Wichita to Oklahoma. And we need to establish regional hub communities in Kansas, regional internet exchange points in places like Wichita, or otherwise those communities are not going to be prepared for the future evolution of the internet. So some of the benefits are probably pretty evident from what I've already shared with you, but some of the benefits of internet exchange points are that they provide a physical home for cloud services and content delivery networks to exchange traffic. Internet exchange points facilitates direct peering between local IXPs, meaning the physical direct connection between one internet service provider to another one, as well as to backhaul providers, to tier one carriers, and to what are called content delivery networks, which is cloud and content services. Internet exchange points, as I said, significantly reduces latency because it reduces the amount of distance that traffic has to travel in order to be exchanged with other networks. These also reduce wholesale internet costs. So most local ISPs, if they're not one of the big carriers, have to buy wholesale internet transit from some carrier. And generally, there isn't a lot of competition in small towns for wholesale IP transit. And so internet exchange points provide a venue where wholesale internet services can be, where there is competition for local ISPs to choose from multiple carriers that have built into the IXP. And beyond that, these facilities improve network resiliency. So if one pathway to the global internet goes down, there's another pathway that it can reach, that can be turned up for that traffic to reach its destination. So the next slide, as I said, there are two primary internet exchange points that serve Kansas. The one in Kansas City at 1102 Grand, and then 910 15th Street in Denver. But we want to try to take some steps to improve that. So the next slide that you see, we would like to establish internet exchange points in places like Hayes, like Dodge City, Manhattan, Wichita, Salina, again, to provide a physical home. And it looks like this, if you're curious, on the next slide. This is what such a facility would look like. Not extremely large. These are essentially modular data centers that are built to, in the data center industry, what's called Tier 3 standards, that are built for a very specific purpose, not to do a tremendous amount of storage and compute, but to provide a physical home for networks to interconnect. These facilities cost in the range of about $1.5 million to about $3.5 million, depending on the size of the facility. The one that you see here on the screen is a 200 kilowatt design that has enough cabinet space for 24 full-size racks. And these are modular facilities, so they can expand as needs grow. And so we can start out with a smaller footprint today and then expand those facilities as more and more networks come into the facilities themselves. So we've actually put together a video, which I'm not going to show you today for limited time, but the web address for this video on internet exchange points is there on the bottom of this slide. I would urge you to, if you want to recap any of the content that I've presented to you today, you can visit that Vimeo web address and watch the educational video on this topic. So that's really all I had to share with you today, other than there's a lot of federal money, obviously, that's coming down the pike for broadband. And I would urge you, as you're thinking about where that money should be invested, to take the money that can be spent for this purpose and take a very small fraction of it, maybe 5%, and dedicate it to building facilities like this that keep Kansas current and prepared for the future. Obviously, the vast majority of that money should go to last mile build out to homes and businesses that don't have it. It's wise for the state to think about the future evolution of the internet and to help these communities be prepared for the future. So particularly with regard to the Capital Projects Fund, that is a component of the American Rescue Plan Act funding that the state is receiving. This is specifically an area where the Capital Projects Fund can provide funding for the build out of these facilities. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions or turn it over to my friend Court.
I think we'll go ahead and open up for questions while it's fresh in everyone's mind, and then we'll move on to Court. Committee, any questions? Senator Hawk.
Thank you for this presentation and for enlightening me about IXPs. I thought that was a new team that might be in the NCAA, and I had whether I needed to get him in my bracket. But So I see Connected Nation logo on one of these. Who provides these, and then what kinds of agreements have to be reached with ISPs that provide internet service to customers?
Sure. So because these are physical buildings, these are buildings in which networks would pay rent, essentially, to establish a presence in the facility. We are a big proponent of these facilities being carrier neutral, meaning that they're built to be a level playing field for all network types, for all local ISPs, the big guys and the small guys, the backhaul providers, the IP transit providers, the content networks, level playing field for everybody. And we really believe that these facilities should be approached from a nonprofit perspective, that these are in existence for the benefit of the region where they're located. So that's why you see our name on the side of the rendering is we want to physically build and operate these facilities with a public benefit in mind from a nonprofit approach. Again, to create a level playing field for everybody so that the future is protected. One of the big things that's going on right now is that big private equity companies are going in and scooping up data centers all over the place. And we want to create these facilities in a way that it's going to have the same ownership structure, the same rules, the same terms and conditions, regardless of where they're located, and that they'll never be sold to anyone, period. So that they'll serve the needs of the community in perpetuity for the life of these assets, which could be up to 50 years. And so that's why we have an interest in this. This is not something that big private equity is investing in communities like Salina or Hayes or Manhattan or even Wichita right now. And that's why there's a role for government to play to help rural communities get ready for the future.
So who would own and control these? State government?
The state government would have a role, a say, certainly, in the terms and conditions that, because we're talking about the potential for infrastructure money to be involved, committed to these facilities, that there would be a role for state governments, and particularly the higher education institutions across the state, to have a role in essentially the rules and terms and conditions under which the facilities operate.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation today and talking about the future of internet and connectivity and things. And my question is about the security of these facilities. We hear a lot about networks getting hacked, and particularly from foreign entities. And so I'm curious what the proposal is to secure these facilities, both physically and from computer hackers. And you're saying you would leave it to our higher education institutions, or could you explain about that further? I think we see a lot of problems with the Chinese and hacking and things like that. And how would we keep these facilities safe were they to be located in Kansas?
That's a great question, and not a question that a lot of policymakers focus on. So I appreciate that, Senator Warren. So there are two issues, as you said. There's the physical access control for people to these facilities. So you'll notice in this particular rendering that there is a perimeter security fence inside the front door of the building. There's a physical man trap where the door has to close behind you, and you have to be authenticated before you can advance into the facility. So there's two layers of security just into the building, with cameras on the perimeter and a central network operations center that would monitor the access, the physical access to the space. But on the network side, because these facilities are not going to be in the operations of the networks themselves. Think of these as physical real estate for networks to connect and peer with one another. So from a cybersecurity perspective, the networks are in charge of their own security. There's nothing that we're doing to facilitate the exchange of traffic other than providing a physical venue and a meet-me room, what's called a meet-me room, for physical jumper cables to connect between networks, right? So we're not doing anything in terms of network traffic management, for instance. That's on the tenants themselves to maintain control. So when I mentioned higher ed institutions, we see higher ed institutions as being a public partner in a public-private partnership in this. It doesn't have to be that way, but certainly we would have a professional operations and maintenance organization dedicated to providing physical security and access control for the buildings. On the network side, that's going to be dependent upon the network tenants themselves that are physically operating the networks inside.
Who would do the overseeing of the hiring of the persons to manage the physical facility? Would that be a government entity with a government security clearance, or what kind of security of personnel are we looking at as well? I mean, I think even though the internet traffic that comes through the server is to be protected by the internet service providers,
Right.
it's still if the physical building is compromised in any way, it would severely impact, I would think, the access to the internet traffic for the end user. And is there a proposal for who would be the employees in the buildings and how they're screened, things like that?
Yes. So facilities like, I'll use 1102 Grand in Kansas City. There are similar internet exchange point facilities all across the U.S. In fact, there are 57 points of interconnection
There's some
across the
model
U.S.
for this from some
There is
other.
definitely a model for this. KCIX or 1102 Grand in Kansas City is a perfect example of a model to follow. This facility would be built to Tier 3 standards, so it's 160 mile per hour wind rated. It's bomb and ballistics proof. It's meant to withstand harsh weather conditions and attempts to sabotage. There are certainly no foolproof designs. And if people knew what they were doing, there are facilities all across the country that could be at major risk of, terrorism or sabotage. Thankfully, there are established processes and procedures to mitigate as much of that as possible.
One more question, if I may, Mr. Chair. So it's a state-by-state basis, and Kansas would then need to put into place, potentially, if this were a partnership between private and government, some protocols and some codifying something to keep these types of facilities safe. Is that right? And you don't have a bill yet about that?
We don't have a bill. These facilities are eligible for the federal program funding, as I mentioned, including the capital projects fund monies that the U.S. Treasury is making available to states right now. So because there are established processes and procedures around security, government has to be involved on a very limited basis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Peterson.
Have you had any discussions with the broadband office?
Well, we were saddened to learn that Stanley Adams recently departed that position at the Department of Commerce. We started conversations with the governor's office on this topic right about the time that Stanley departed. So we're in the process of waiting to see who his replacement is going to be. This is an area where the broadband office needs to be involved. And I'm very hopeful that as soon as his replacement is named, we'll have that conversation.
You might want to start with his interim, Melissa Stanley.
Okay, we will definitely do that.
Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. For us to be where we need to be, in your opinion today, how much are we talking? Is it the $1.5 million times 4 or 5?
Roughly. So the facility size in a place like Hayes or Salina is going to be necessarily smaller than it is going to be in Wichita. So the range is between $1.5 and $3.5 million. And we can start with a couple and move up to 4 or 5 over time. It doesn't have to be all of them all at once.
So as we look forward, this latency thing with these locations and we get more traffic on it, do you envision that there'll be latencies more in between to handle the volume, or is this going to take care of us? That's one question. The other one is, as we go forward, who pays for this? What's the cost on that thing?
So, Senator Fagg, I think the answer to your first question is the goal is to reduce latency as near to zero as possible. So bringing it out of Kansas City and into smaller communities does that. The second part of your question was, what are the operations and maintenance costs? So based on our projections, the network tenants that would occupy these facilities and pay monthly rent to be in these facilities would pay for the operations and maintenance costs. The challenge is just the capital construction cost at the beginning. And that's why big private equity firms have not invested in facilities in smaller communities in Kansas, because of that capital construction cost at the beginning.
One more quick question, then we'll move on to court. Senator Hawk.
So this looks like it's a fiber hub for the
Essentially,
fiber
yes.
that's out there. So what's the connection in terms of what might happen with low orbit satellites like Starlink, et cetera? Is that going to have a connection to these IXPs?
Well, absolutely. Low Earth orbiting satellites like Starlink and like OneWeb all have to physically connect back to internet exchange facilities themselves to exchange traffic. So Starlink is essentially a replacement for last mile connectivity. It's a replacement for that cable service or fixed wireless service. The Starlink still needs to connect to IXPs to exchange traffic. So presumably Starlink and OneWeb and other networks that are forecast to be built out that would operate as low Earth orbiting satellites would still need to have a presence in facilities like this.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll see what other questions come up after Court has his presentation. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
And we'll just ask Court Buffington, President and Executive Director of CANRN, to come up and tell us about his presentation on Anchor Institution Broadband. Court, give you a second to plug in. And
Oh, awesome. It actually came up correctly the first time. I struggle with technology. I don't
we all
mind
do from time to
admitting
time.
that.
Yeah. Just state your name when you're ready to go, Court, and go.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. Chairman Thompson, I'm Court Buffington. I'm the Executive Director and President of CANRN. That's the Kansas Research and Education Network. So why am I here today? I want to give you a brief presentation. I'm not speaking specifically about any particular legislation or project, more of information about an area of broadband connectivity that we don't hear about quite so frequently. Brent and I did not plan this to both be here today. In fact, he emailed me last night and said, hey, I'm going to be in Topeka. Do you want to get some coffee? And I said, well, actually, I'm going to be in the same room you're in tomorrow. So our presentations fit together really closely. You're going to see a lot of very similar information from a slightly different vantage point today. And I want to say, first off, before I get into this, I want to give a shout out to our telecommunications industry in Kansas, big and small. I'm going to be talking about some things today that we often don't hear when we have discussions with them. It's not because it's not important to them or they're not involved with it. It's just not, again, it's not that big 900-pound gorilla of last mile connectivity, primarily for residential users in rural areas. So as you always get when someone comes here, they want to talk about their organization a bit. Our name is an acronym. CANRN stands for the Kansas Research and Education Network. We are what is referred to as an R&E network. That stands for Research and Education. We date to the dawn of internet, and we exist to fulfill a unique need in advanced networking services, primarily for higher ed. We were started by the public universities in Kansas, and over time we've expanded out to serve public libraries, K-12s, community colleges, even some healthcare and local and county governments. We do not have, outside of higher ed, we do not have a critical mass of those institutions as members. For example, about 10% of the state's K-12s are involved with us. Another thing about us, CANRN is a bit unique. We've never received direct state or federal funding for our operation. There are 44 of us in the United States, and we are one of the few who has not It's not a blame issue, it's just the way things work here, the way our university system's set up, the way our government's been involved. We've just not been in that situation. So while we are one of the oldest of our kind, we're also one of the smallest in the nation. I am proud of our technology achievements, however. We have been on the forefront of most technology advancements in our area. Just to emphasize the point that we are not an anomaly, I've provided you a map of from an organization called the Quilt, that is a national organization of R&E networks, to show how extensive we are. We're all connected to each other. For example, CanRen is connected directly to our peer organization Network Nebraska, our peer organization MoreNet in Missouri, and OneNet in Oklahoma, and Auron in Arkansas. We don't have a direct connection into Colorado. So what's the issue? We hear a lot about digital divide, and we are starting to create progress, good progress, on the digital divide at home, residential, small businesses. The institutional digital divide is a little bit different. We haven't really made the same progress there. Initiatives like the Broadband Acceleration Program and myriad of funding under Spark, as well as future programs, along with our telecommunications industry, have made a lot of strides. But what we're getting into when we talk about the anchor institutions that CanRen serves is the middle mile that Brent already brought up. Because the services that we need to serve these anchor institutions aren't the same as what we use at home or in a small business. It's not just about what I refer to as plain old internet service anymore. And access and affordability, we talk about that a lot. But access and affordability mean different things depending on who you are. If the service you need is fundamentally different than what we provide for residential users, even if an area is very well covered for them, there still may be an access problem for the needs of the anchor institution. Affordability can be a big thing too. While larger scale services for larger organizations you would expect to cost more money, some of them are really out of line. CanRen just concluded an RFP process to purchase from the telecom industry transport services. That's not internet service, that's just a transport service to move data from insights to our backbone network. 20% of our Insight member institutions in the state, we couldn't even get 10 gigabit per second. Transport, not internet, but transport pricing for. Another 20% was over $5,000 a month, just for the transport. That's not for the wholesale internet that gets put on top of it or any other services. That's just to move that data, 50 to 100 miles across the state. So that's fully 40% of our 86 members that we would struggle to get 10 gigabit per second connectivity to. 10 gigabit per second. Why do they need 10 gig? We're talking about 1 gig at home. Remember what happened back when this pandemic hit? And all of a sudden, how many of us learned that when we're all working from home, in my case, my wife was at home, my daughter was at home, and it wasn't just me on my work at home Wednesday trying to make online meetings anymore, it was all three of us. So we've seen the need for services like gigabit at home. But when we talk about, and I'm going to use a higher education example, when we talk about the institution level, 10 gigabits per second is kind of the 1 gig. And I'm not talking about a public university, I'm talking about even a community college here. Higher education institutions are kind of like entire towns unto themselves when you think about it. I've got an infographic here. Many of them have commercial partnerships. I think about Fort Scott Community College and their partnership with John Deere. Many of them have other businesses present on campus, bookstores, food service, so related third-party operations. They have satellite campuses they have to provide services to. They have academic departments. They have to be concerned with disaster recovery and backup. They provide healthcare services to their students. They need connectivity for healthcare. And finally, the 800-pound gorilla is they're a residential provider themselves. If they've got dorms, they're a residential internet provider to all those students who live on campus. Of note, I was thinking when I drew this about Barton Community College, and I looked them up. I did not know the answer in advance. My hometown is Frontenac, Kansas. Barton Community College has an enrollment of about 1,000 people more than Frontenac does. So it became really stark to me when I started looking at some of these numbers that our member institutions really are almost self-contained cities in many ways. So what are these things that I say they need that are different than plain old internet? They do need an internet service. They need the ability to transport data from point A to point Z. That would be, say, if they had a remote campus somewhere or for disaster recovery and business continuity. A lot of our members today are already moving a lot of traffic to another institution in the state. Actually, Wichita State seems to be the shining star of this, just about. Pittsburgh State, Fort Hays State, Emporia State, Johnson County Community College, at least, are all using Wichita State as a remote disaster recovery center. You don't, folks, you don't ship that over the internet when you do that. We start talking about, again, this thing's about information security. You want to have private network connections to move that kind of data over. They need guaranteed performance. You know, when we start talking about getting into cloud resources or, you know, replicating databases of student information in real time to multiple external locations, you need very, very good performance. Layered cybersecurity. Cybersecurity isn't something you do in one place anymore. You don't just have a firewall and call it good. We layer cybersecurity throughout the network. There are things that CANREN can do at the backbone network provider level that can help protect our institutions. It doesn't give them all of the protection they need, but it provides a layer. It allows us to focus on the things we can focus on, gives them more opportunity to focus their resources on things that they have to do themselves. So we talk about broadband infrastructure a lot. The problem I see is that we use the term broadband infrastructure and internet service synonymously. We speak about them as if they're the same thing. Broadband infrastructure is not internet service. Broadband infrastructure enables internet service, but it also enables all of these other things as well. The awareness I would like to raise, if nothing else, is that if we are going to spend public funding on broadband infrastructure, that we ensure that all of the services that are enabled with broadband infrastructure are made accessible and affordable, not just internet service. I hope I've made a good case that it's not just about bits per second anymore, and Brent really did a lot of the work for me. I cut out some of my narrative about not just faster. Reliability is very important. Resiliency is very important. I'll throw in one anecdote about how much goes to Kansas City, and what my esteemed colleague did not say is 1102 grand is not in Kansas. Kansas City is in the name, it's in Missouri. There is no internet exchange point in the state of Kansas. CanRen pays very dearly to get south out of Wichita and have high capacity into Tulsa in a partnership with our sister organization in Oklahoma, OneNet. But Kansas is really a desert for this stuff. Granted, it's not that far into Missouri. I've lived in Kansas all my life. I guess I'm kind of proud. I would really like to see Kansas do better. But it isn't just about speed. We have to have all of these other attributes. I've been speaking very abstractly about this. I do want to give you one concrete example. I'm going to give you an example of the cloud. You know, I work in this industry, and there are days I don't know what cloud means. So I really hope that none of you feel like it's absolutely crystal clear. But the bottom line, cloud services really are taking something that you used to do on premise, you're taking it off premise, and you're paying someone else to do it in another location where they have a lot bigger economies of scale and volume. So they can provide it faster, better, cheaper, more resiliency, whatever. The problem with going to the cloud, we hear everyone talk about going to the cloud. We hear institutions, I hear higher eds all the time. I hear even local governments talking about going to the cloud and saving money. The problem is you are now completely and wholly dependent on your broadband-based connectivity to carry out basic functions. I talked about Barton Community College earlier. And by the way, their CIO is CanRen's board chair this year. As a nonprofit, we've got board members that are elected from our membership. So I'm picking on my boss. She knows I'm doing this. Barton moved their student information system and enterprise resource planning to the cloud. Saved them a lot of money. Servers they didn't have to maintain on campus. Skill sets they don't have to maintain there. They can focus on other things that they can't move out. But now they can't operate their student information system. They can't operate their ERP if their connectivity is down. So the price of the cloud is having really good broadband connectivity. And if you've got that, the cloud is great. If you don't, the cloud isn't quite the value proposition it appears to be. So I will go through these things in the cloud. The cloud is mostly based on, you hear these terms, software as a service. That means someone else is running the software for you and you're just using it. You don't have to deal with installing it yourself. You don't have to deal with the fact that when you tried to bring it up, it didn't work. Now you're trying to figure out how to uninstall it and reinstall it. And we've all been there, right? Platform as a service. That's the operating system. Someone else is taking care of that. You can go, remotely log in to someone else's. If you're a Windows user, it's like logging into Windows that somebody else is running and you can install your own software and use it, but you don't have to deal with Windows Update, thank God. Infrastructure as a service. That's where somebody else owns the bare metal hardware and you're buying time on a piece of it that ends up looking to you a lot like a bare metal computer that then you have to install an operating system on and software on and use. These are the main things that happen in the cloud. And it gets a little bit deeper because most software as a service providers are using infrastructure as a service providers to run their platforms on. The vast majority of everything that is in the cloud today in the United States really is focused on East Coast, West Coast, Dallas, and Chicago. Much to Brent's point, that's a pretty long trip. And not only does latency increase when we make those longer trips to the cloud, but every mile we have to transit is another mile that's vulnerable to a failure, a weather event, a backhoe, a cybersecurity event, et cetera. I do have an ask. No one comes here without asking you for something, do we? Please ensure that the money that Kansas invests in broadband infrastructure creates both access and affordability for all broadband services and not just internet service. Again, internet service is extremely important. It is the biggest thing we focus on. I am not saying that what we've done in those areas are unnecessary. I'm here to try to give a voice to another aspect of broadband connectivity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all again.
Very good, Court. Thank you. Committee, any questions? Senator Hawk.
So how do I know when I have a latency problem? Is it when I do my speed test and my download and upload speeds look terrible, or?
Interesting. I'm gonna digress for a little bit of an engineering anecdote. I used to be a technical person. I'm recovering in the ranks of administration. And I'm going to modify it a little bit for today's day and age. And that would be never underestimate the bandwidth of a minivan full of hard disk drives barreling down the interstate. You can fill a car with a whole bunch of disk drives and you can drive it across the state, and that is a ton of bandwidth. If you look at the total number of bytes stored and how long it took you to drive there and divide that by second, you could be moving data really, really fast. The problem is the latency is terrible. A lot of speed tests will give you a latency number. It's not the big number. It's usually a smaller number somewhere, but they will tell you what the average latency is. One of the problems with latency is the algorithms that we use to transmit data have to ensure reliable connectivity. That means they don't want to just sit there blasting information out, not knowing if the other end is getting it. So what they do is they send a little bit and wait to see how long before they get an acknowledgement. This is what's happening in our computers, our smartphones, everything. Hey, that was pretty good. I'm going to send a little bit more. But the second they start seeing either a little bit of data loss or they start seeing the round trip time climb, they stop attempting to send data faster. Because if you send so fast that you miss a piece, it takes a lot of time to go back and fill in the gap. So that's one of the big things with latency. Latency ends up being something that affects the actual throughput bandwidth you achieve. You could have a very high speed connection, but because of latency, the devices connected to it won't utilize everything that's available. But do look for the small numbers on speed tests. Most of them have it. Some of them might have like an advanced button you can click. It'll be in there somewhere.
One quick follow-up. So on your next to the last slide, where you talked about software as service, platform as service, infrastructure as service, seems to me from reports that we've gotten, particularly in Ways and Means, is we're doing more of all three of those things and moved in that direction. Does that, I assume all of that requires more bandwidth. And so what kind of a time crunch are we under not having IXPs? Because what I'm hearing from you and Brent is we probably have serious latency problems now, and most of us are not using enough to know it's a problem. And then secondly, it's going to be a huge issue as more and more things move, quote, to the cloud.
Wow, great question. So I'm trying to speak a little bit more broadly about all middle mile infrastructure. IXPs are part of it. I've been doing this for a lot of years. This middle mile infrastructure is kind of like high blood pressure, the silent killer. We don't have last mile infrastructure today. Our middle mile looks pretty good today. But every time we improve our last mile infrastructure, we need an equal amount of middle mile infrastructure to stand behind it to make it work. My fear is that our middle mile situation is a bit of a sleeping giant, that we won't realize that we have a problem until we start solving. If the best outcome is we fix the broadband problem for our state. My fear is that somewhere along the way, after we've developed all of our programs and we've looked at how we want to spend the federal money, that we get halfway there, 3/4 of the way there, and then we realize that there's a middle mile problem once we've started depending on that middle mile more to feed the last mile. And absolutely, the more we solve the last mile problem, I promise, Senator, I'm going to answer this. As we improve last mile connectivity, we encourage people to move more things to the cloud, to take more advantage of cloud services. If we don't have the resiliency, the reliability, the cybersecurity aspects in place, we're kind of building that empire on a house of cards. So when is it going to happen? I don't know. Is it likely to happen? What I buy is middle mile at CanRen. What we buy is middle mile. We're buying it from the carrier community. To be clear, I don't want to build it myself. I don't want to own it. I just want to be able to buy it at an affordable, accessible price from the carriers. We already have a lot of problems. I said earlier, 40% we can't get 10 gig to at all. And if you can't, Brent and I have both spent a lot of time talking about things that are important other than bandwidth. Bandwidth is really important up until the moment where you have enough. The moment you have enough, then all of these other things come into play. So at some level, we're struggling still to just be able to get the bandwidth at an affordable price to find out how much trouble there is. But if we can't get 10 gig at an affordable, accessible price at most of our community colleges today, I would say we don't even really know where the tip of the iceberg is on what our middle mile needs are going to be, because it won't be too many years before 1 gig is no longer good at home.
Any other questions, committee? Senator Corson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Brent, maybe I should have asked this to you, and I apologize if that's the case. From just like a technical perspective, so the IXP is funded by the fees that folks pay, but who is like the legal owner of the site, and who is, paying insurance and upkeep and maintenance, just kind of all those boring things? How does that work? Like, who is the entity that is considered, I guess, the owner, for lack of a better term? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like you to invite Brent to answer that, because that is outside of my wheelhouse.
Very good. And Brent, just restate your name for the.
Sure. Brent Legg with Connected Nation. So, for instance, 1102 Grand in Kansas City is owned by a large private equity company. We're proposing that in this situation, these facilities should be owned by an organization like us that operates them for the benefit of the public. So, from a nonprofit perspective. So, not just in Kansas, but in about 100 locations across the country, these types of facilities need to be established. And we believe they should be operated from a nonprofit with the purpose of serving a public benefit. So our organization would be, if we have the opportunity to become a grantee, would be the owner and operator of these facilities. Just like the big data center companies are owned by private entities in other cities, including 1102 Grand. Yeah.
Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, oh, yes, did you want to address that, Cord?
I'll throw something on top of that if I may.
Yes, sir.
CanRen has to buy space in the kind of facilities that Brent talks about. We do that in partnership with OneNet in Oklahoma. We do it in 2 different locations in downtown Kansas City. For what it's worth, when 1102 Grand started, the amount that CanRen paid them compared to our other thing, what we pay for wholesale internet, et cetera, what we paid them was almost round off error for that monthly rent. That was, when did we start there? 14 years ago. Today, I now pay Neutrality, the owner of 1102 Grand, I pay them more a year than I pay for wholesale internet. It's becoming a problem just for me to afford to stay in the building. And by the way, we haven't increased our footprint there in almost 12 years. So from, granted, Neutrality needs to make a profit. I'm good with that. But that has been a really, really incredible increase in price.
Mr. Chairman, may I make one more comment about that?
Sure thing.
So stability and predictability, I'm Brent Legg with Connected Nation again for the record. Stability and predictability with regard to rates and structures, right? You don't want to create a scenario where a lot of network tenants are in a building and that building becomes really, really valuable. And all of a sudden it gets sold to someone and then they jack up everybody's rates. And the situation like that has happened at 1102 Grand. They're a profit-making company. But they've built something that has compounded upon itself. And so it's much more valuable today than what it was before. And they know they can charge the rates because once networks establish a physical presence somewhere, they never want to leave. And so we're talking about a different scenario where there's predictability and stability with regard to the operations and maintenance costs over the long term. So there are never going to be any huge price increases relative to what Court just shared with you about 1102 Grand.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much. Committee, we're basically out of time. I want to be able to give time to get down there. Remember to take your folders, but before we go, I do want to thank our committee staff for their hard work. Heather and Nick and Sheila and Rachel and Jade. They all work very, very hard. I know I work, Sheila, very hard. I call Nick and Heather at odd times of the day and night, and I appreciate their work, and I appreciate all your work as well in the committee this year, and I appreciate it very much. Senator Francisco?
Thank you. May I also just shout out for the minutes and what Sheila has done. And I didn't even have to get her my correction. She got it to me ahead of time, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Thank you, committee, for your work. We're done for the year, and with that, we are adjourned.